The Woman Who Died Before Midnight, a Miss Marple Mystery. Chapter 1. The Marquee at 10 to 10. The scream came from the flower tent, thin and quickly swallowed by the noise of the band. For a moment nobody moved. The trestle tables were still crowded with plates of cold ham and treacle tart, and somewhere behind the hedge a fiddle sawed its way gamely through a tune nobody was dancing to anymore. Then Mrs. Constantine, the vicar's wife, came out from between the canvas flaps with her hand pressed flat against her chest, and the whole harvest supper seemed to draw in its breath at once. "It's Mrs. Alderton," she said. I think she's dead." Miss Jane Marple, who had been sitting rather contentedly at the end of a bench with a cup of tea gone lukewarm in her hand, set the cup down without spilling a drop, and rose with the unhurried briskness of a woman who has learned, over many years, that panic rarely helps and sometimes actively hinders. She was not, strictly speaking, of Detheridge Parva. She was staying with her second cousin Millicent, who had taken a cottage near the old mill for the autumn and had been persuaded to the harvest supper on the promise of good marrows and better gossip. She had had, so far, both. Inside the marquee the light was dim, filtered gold through canvas, and it took a moment for eyes to adjust. Prudence Alderton sat in the wicker chair that had been carried out especially for her, chairwoman's privilege, her head fallen a little to one side, a glass of barley water untouched on the small table at her elbow, and her hand curled loosely in her lap, as though she had simply stopped, mid-gesture, in the act of making a point. "Don't crowd in," said Miss Marple, mildly, to the dozen people now pressing at the tent flap. "Someone had better fetch Dr. Combe. He was here a moment ago, by the cider barrels." Nobody argued with her. It was one of Miss Marple's small, permanent talents that people did not argue with her, even people who had never met her before that hour. Dr. Nathaniel Combe arrived within 2 minutes, young and a little breathless, his dinner jacket still buttoned wrong from where he'd dressed in a hurry that morning for a confinement 3 miles off. He knelt by the chair, took the wrist, and was quiet for longer than anyone liked. "She's gone," he said at last. "Some time ago, I should think. 20 minutes, perhaps more." "Her heart," said Colonel Pike from the doorway, in the tone of a man restoring order to a disordered world. Everyone knew her heart was weak. Combe himself has said so a dozen times. "Yes," said Dr. Combe, but he did not look entirely comfortable saying it, and Miss Marple, who noticed a great many things that other people considered beneath noticing, observed that he glanced, just once, at the little table beside the chair, where the glass of barley water stood 3/4 full and slightly cloudy, as though something had not quite dissolved. Outside, the fiddle finally stopped. It was, Miss Marple thought, a very ordinary sort of evening to have ended so badly. The last warm night of a fine September, the fields cut and stacked, the vicar's raffle only half drawn, and now Mrs. Prudence Alderton, chairwoman of the Detheridge Parva Garden and Horticultural Society, sitting quite still in her chair, as though waiting for someone to bring her another cup of tea. Nobody, as it turned out, was going to bring her anything ever again. By the time the doctor rose to his feet and asked, with careful neutrality, whether anyone had seen Mrs. Alderton take her evening drops, the marquee had gone very quiet indeed, and several people were looking with sudden, unconvincing interest at their own shoes. Chapter 2. A Village at its Best and Worst. By 10 o'clock the next morning, Detheridge Parva had already decided, collectively and with great confidence, exactly what had happened. Mrs. Alderton had died of her heart, everyone agreed, because everyone had always said her heart would go one day, and there was a grim satisfaction in a prophecy fulfilled, even an unhappy one. The baker's wife said she had seen it coming for 12 months. The verger said he'd remarked on her colour only last Sunday. Nobody, on the whole, seemed especially sorry, which struck Miss Marple, over her cousin's excellent breakfast kippers, as rather more interesting than the death itself. She wasn't a well-liked woman then, she said, not quite a question. Millicent, who had lived in the village for 11 years and knew everyone's business with the placid thoroughness of the truly idle, made a small sound that was not quite a laugh. "Liked isn't the word I'd choose, Jane. Respected, perhaps. Feared, more like, in a genteel sort of way. She ran that garden society as though it were a regiment, and she had opinions about everyone's roses and everyone's morals, and she was not backward about sharing either. People don't care for that sort of frankness. No, Millicent agreed, buttering her toast with unusual attention, and there were one or two, I dare say, who had rather more to be frank about than roses. Miss Marple's eyes, faded blue and entirely without malice, sharpened very slightly at that, though her expression did not change at all. "You mean she knew things about people?" "I mean," said Millicent, "that Prudence Alderton kept a little green notebook, and she was known to mention its existence at moments calculated to be most uncomfortable. Ask Doris at the tea shop about it sometime, if she'll talk to you, which I doubt. Ask the Colonel. Ask anybody, really, except perhaps the vicar, who is too good a man to gossip and too poor an actor to hide that he's relieved she's gone." It was, Miss Marple reflected, walking down through the village an hour later, with a basket over her arm, and no very pressing errand in it. Remarkable how much could be learned by simply being an old woman with time on her hands and an interest in wool. She stopped at the post office. She stopped at the churchyard wall, where the sexton was clipping grass, and glad of an audience. She stopped, at last, outside the small window of Fenwick's tea shop, where a girl of perhaps 22 was arranging scones in the window with the particular tightness of movement that suggested a person keeping a great many feelings very carefully controlled. The girl's name, Miss Marple already knew, was Doris Fenwick, and she did not look up when the little bell above the door rang. "A pot of tea, please, my dear, if you're not too busy," said Miss Marple, settling herself at the corner table, with the comfortable air of someone who intends to stay some time. "It's a sad business, about poor Mrs. Alderton." Doris's hands, folding a napkin, went very still for a moment. "Yes," she said, "very sad. You knew her well, I expect. In a village this size, everyone knows everyone." "Not well," said Doris, too quickly, and then, perhaps hearing how it sounded, added, "She came in for her tea most afternoons. Lapsang, no sugar. She was very particular. People with strong opinions on gardening usually are particular about everything," said Miss Marple comfortably, and was rewarded by the faintest twitch of something, not quite a smile, not quite a grimace, at the corner of the girl's mouth before she disappeared back behind the counter and did not, for the rest of Miss Marple's visit, meet her eyes again. It was, Miss Marple thought, exactly the sort of small, ordinary reticence that a sharp observer learns to notice, not because it proved anything, but because grief, in her long experience, and guilt, and simple relief all wore remarkably similar faces on people unpracticed in hiding them. She finished her tea, left a generous sixpence, and went out again into the mild September sunshine to see what else the village might, without quite meaning to, tell her. Chapter 3. The Colonel's Temper Inspector Alan Whitcomb of the County Police arrived from Market Sedding at 11:30, a broad, unhurried man with the look of someone who had hoped, that particular week, for nothing more taxing than a stolen bicycle. He had not expected, on cutting open Mrs. Alderton's stomach contents for analysis as routine caution, Dr. Combe had insisted upon it, rather to the coroner's irritation, to be told by the county pathologist, within 2 days, that the deceased had ingested a quantity of digitalis glycoside very considerably in excess of anything a weak heart might reasonably account for, and that persons with weak hearts, moreover, were not in the general way of dosing themselves with quantities sufficient to stop 3 ordinary hearts at once. "Murder, then," said Whitcomb to Dr. Combe, in the privacy of the surgery, with the flat distaste of a man for whom murder meant weeks of paperwork. "It rather looks like it," said Combe. "She took heart drops of her own prescription, tincture of digitalis, in small and carefully measured doses, for a genuine mild irregularity. I prescribed them myself and dispensed them myself, in a bottle she kept always in a little case at her waist, along with a silver dropper for measuring. 7 drops, night and morning, in barley water. It's not a preparation that kills by accident, Inspector. Someone would have had to want it to." "And who," said Whitcomb, reaching for his notebook with the air of a man beginning a very long list, had reason to want Mrs. Prudence Alderton dead? It was a question the inspector found, over the following 2 days, that almost everyone in Detheridge Parva was willing to help him answer, usually by mentioning somebody else. Colonel Harland Pike, treasurer of the Garden Society, was the first name offered by no fewer than 4 separate villagers, on the grounds, freely supplied, that he and Mrs. Alderton had quarrelled bitterly, publicly, and at length, not 4 days before her death, over the Society's accounts. "She was as good as calling me a thief," said the colonel, when Whitcomb found him in his greenhouse, savagely repotting a chrysanthemum that had done nothing to deserve it. "In front of the whole committee, said the subscription money didn't tally, and looked at me as though I'd had my hand in the till. I told her to her face she was a meddling old harridan, and she could audit the books herself if she doubted my word, which she did, Inspector, at considerable and tedious length, and found not a farthing out of place. But she never apologized, not her way." "You were angry with her?" "Furiously," said the colonel, without apparent shame. "I've been angry with a good many people in my life, Inspector, and have not murdered one of them yet. Ask my Batman in Burma. Ask my second wife. Bad temper is not evidence of poison." It was, Miss Marple thought later, when Millicent relayed the exchange with relish over the sherry, rather a good answer, as answers went, the sort of blunt, unguarded honesty that innocent men could afford, and guilty men, on the whole, could not quite manage. But she had learned long ago not to acquit a man simply because his temper was loud and his conscience apparently clear. Loud tempers, in her experience, sometimes concealed the quietest and most patient of grievances, and the colonel, for all his bluster, had access, as treasurer, as a man forever popping in and out of the Alderton house on society business, to a great many opportunities that a stranger would not have had. She said none of this to Millicent. She merely asked, with the mild curiosity of an old woman with nothing better to do, whether the colonel had been at the harvest supper on the night in question, and for how long, and whether anyone had actually seen him near the marquee at 10 minutes to 10. Millicent did not know, but she thought Doris Fenwick might, since Doris had been helping serve the urn all evening from a table not 6 feet from the marquee entrance, and saw, as she put it, simply everyone come and go, poor lamb, though she said barely a word about any of it since. Miss Marple filed this away with the small private satisfaction of a woman adding a promising new thread to an already interesting tapestry. Chapter 4. What Doris Would Not Say. Inspector Whitcomb found Doris Fenwick a difficult witness, not because she was evasive in any way he could put his finger on, but because she answered every question exactly, minimally, and with her eyes fixed somewhere over his left shoulder. Yes, she had been at the urn table all evening. Yes, she had seen Colonel Pike pass by twice, once going in and once coming out, though she could not say to the minute when. Yes, she had seen the vicar's wife. Yes, young Mr. Trent, from the solicitor's office, had come by for cider not long before the scream, looking, she thought, rather pale, though it had been a warm night, and everyone was flushed with dancing. "And Mrs. Marsh?" asked Whitcomb, Mrs. Alderton's companion. "Did you see her?" For the first time in the interview, Doris's composure slipped. Not dramatically, only a small tightening around the eyes, quickly smoothed. "Agnes brings Mrs. Alderton's tonic to her every evening at 10:15, Doris said. "Everyone knows that. It's not a secret. But did you see her do it that night?" "I don't remember," said Doris, and it was, Whitcomb noted afterward, the only answer in the entire interview that sounded, to his experienced ear, like a lie carefully rehearsed rather than a simple failure of memory. Miss Marple, hearing this account from Millicent, who had it, in turn, from the inspector's sergeant, who liked his pint at the Wheatsheaf and was not, on the whole, discreet, thought it a small thing, but small things, in her considerable experience, were very often the hinges on which large and terrible doors swung. "She protects the companion," Miss Marple said, half to herself, stirring her tea with a thoughtfulness Millicent had learned, over the years, not to interrupt. "That is interesting, Millicent. 2 young women, apparently unconnected, and one shields the other without being asked. A host, of people do not generally extend themselves to protect a person they merely happen to know slightly. Perhaps she's fond of her. Agnes Marsh is a kind soul from what I hear, put upon dreadfully by that Alderton woman, but kind. Perhaps, said Miss Marple, and left it there, though she did not, in her own mind, leave it there at all. She had, over a long lifetime in St. Mary Mead and out of it, developed a private theory, never stated aloud, because it sounded, she knew, both fanciful and faintly ridiculous, that people in villages arrange themselves, without ever quite realizing it, into patterns as fixed and legible as the plantings in a formal garden. The showy blooms everyone noticed and admired or resented, and the quiet, unregarded shrubs along the border that did the actual, patient work of holding the soil together, and that nobody thought to examine at all, because nobody had ever thought them worth examining. Agnes Marsh, by every account she had gathered so far, was very much a border shrub. 11 years as Mrs. Alderton's companion, general factotum, unpaid confidant, keeper of the household accounts, arranger of flowers, listener to complaints, at the beck and call of a difficult woman for a wage that Millicent described, with some indignation, as little better than a servant's, and less thanks. A grey, quiet, careful woman of perhaps 45, who had, so far as anyone could recall, never raised her voice, never taken a holiday, and never once, in 11 years, been heard to complain. It was, Miss Marple thought, exactly the sort of unbroken, uncomplaining patience that either signified a genuinely gentle soul with no grievance to speak of, or else concealed the very deepest and oldest kind of grievance there was, the kind that has had so many years to settle and compress that it no longer even feels, to the person carrying it, like anger at all, but simply like the shape of one's own life. She resolved, over a second cup of tea, to make Agnes Marsh's acquaintance as soon as it could be reasonably managed. Chapter 5. The Empty Case. It was Dr. Combe, of all people, who first mentioned the missing dropper, and he mentioned it almost apologetically, as though embarrassed to trouble the inspector with something so trivial. "It's only that she was so particular about it," he said, when Whitcomb called at the surgery again. "The little silver case, dropper and bottle both, on a chain, worn at her waist like a chatelaine. She had it made specially, years ago, after I first prescribed the drops, because she said she'd sooner die than be caught fumbling with a paper twist of medicine in front of the whole society like some invalid. I've seen that case on her 100 times. It wasn't there when we found her." "Not there? Are you certain?" "Quite certain. I looked, particularly, because I wanted to see how many drops the bottle showed missing, to gauge the dose. There was no case at all, not on her belt, not in her bag, not on the table, just an empty glass of barley water." Whitcomb's men searched the marquee, the grass around it, the tables, the rubbish sacks from the supper, and found nothing. They searched Mrs. Alderton's house on Elm Walk, where Agnes Marsh lived also, in the small back bedroom that had been hers for 11 years, and found the dropper case at last in the most ordinary place imaginable, in the top drawer of Mrs. Alderton's own dressing table, precisely where it was kept every night when she came home, as though it had never left the house at all. Which was, Miss Marple thought, when she heard the detail from Millicent, who had heard it from the vicar's wife, who had heard it from the sergeant's sister who did the Aldertons' washing, which was, on the face of it, exactly what one would expect, and exactly what made the whole business so curious. "But don't you see," she said, when Millicent failed, gently, to see, "if the case was found at home, quite properly put away, then either Mrs. Alderton did not take it to the supper at all that evening, in which case, how did she take her 7 drops, since she never trusted anyone but herself to measure them, being so particular, as the doctor says, or else she did take it, and somebody returned it to the drawer afterward, very carefully, so that its absence at the marquee would not be remarked upon for long." "You mean someone took it from her, used it, or used something like it, and then walked all the way back to Elm Walk to put it back before the alarm was raised?" "I mean," said Miss Marple, "that somebody wanted, very much, for that little silver case to be found exactly where it ought to be, and not lying about in the grass near the marquee, where an inconvenient question might attach to it. That is not the behavior of panic, Millicent. That is the behavior of a person thinking very clearly indeed, under circumstances that would have reduced most of us to a state of complete collapse, and thinking, moreover, ahead rather than merely reacting. It suggests, to me, someone who knew the house very well, well enough to slip in and out without being noticed, on an evening when half the village was up at the supper and the other half was watching the fireworks from their own gardens. Agnes Marsh, said Millicent slowly. Agnes Marsh, Miss Marple agreed, or someone very like her in habits and opportunity. But it is a long step, my dear, from opportunity to certainty, and I have been wrong before, though I confess not often. There is still the small matter of why. A companion of 11 years' faithful service does not generally poison her employer over a sharp word. However many sharp words there may have been, there will be something else beneath it. There generally is. Chapter 6. The Green Notebook. The Green Notebook, when Inspector Whitcomb finally located it, in a locked drawer of Mrs. Alderton's writing desk, the key found on a ribbon around the dead woman's own neck, worn beneath her blouse where no one had thought to look until the second day, proved to be exactly as unpleasant as its reputation had promised. It was not, strictly, a diary. It was a ledger of sorts, kept in Mrs. Alderton's small, upright hand, and it recorded, with the dry precision of a woman auditing souls as she audited flower show entries, a great many things that the people of Detheridge Parva would very much rather have kept to themselves. Colonel Pike's entry noted, in 3 lines, a debt to a bookmaker in Market Sedding, settled the previous spring with money that did not, in Mrs. Alderton's careful estimation, match his pension. Mrs. Ivy Constantine's entry, 3 pages, closely written, recorded a first marriage, in 1938, to a man named Frank Doubleday, of which there was no record of dissolution before her marriage to the vicar in 1946, a fact Mrs. Alderton had apparently uncovered through a cousin in the north and had been, the notebook made plain, saving for the appropriate moment. Young Osborne Trent's page dealt with his father, a bank clerk dismissed 8 years before under circumstances the notebook termed, with brutal economy, irregularities never prosecuted, thanks to family shame and a forgiving manager, and noted further Mr. Trent Jr.'s recent and unsuitable engagement to a girl of, in Mrs. Alderton's phrase, trade connections unbecoming to a professional man, an engagement Mrs. Alderton had made plain, in conversation with at least 3 people, that she intended to see broken. There was, Whitcomb noted with some relief, no entry at all for Doris Fenwick, nor, and this struck him as odd, given the woman's proximity, any entry whatsoever for Agnes Marsh. Nothing on the companion, he said to Miss Marple, whom he had, by the 4th day, come to consult rather more often than strict procedure required, having formed the private and accurate opinion that the old lady saw a great deal more than she ever volunteered unasked for. 11 years in the house, and not a line about her. Doesn't that strike you as strange, given how thorough the woman was about everyone else? It strikes me, said Miss Marple, turning her teacup slowly on its saucer, as the most interesting thing in the whole dreadful little book, Inspector. Consider it, Mrs. Alderton recorded, with evident relish, the secrets of a colonel, a vicar's wife, and a young clerk, people she saw perhaps once a week, at committee meetings and church. And yet of the one woman who lived under her roof for 11 years, who dressed her and nursed her through 2 winters of bronchitis, and knew, I should think, every habit and humour and secret grievance she possessed, of that woman, nothing at all. Now, Inspector, does that suggest to you a woman about whom there was nothing to know, or a woman whose secret Mrs. Alderton did not need to write down, because she carried it in her head every single day, and used it, perhaps, rather more directly than a note in a book? Whitcomb was silent for a moment. You think she was blackmailing her, not with a threat on paper, with, what, a look, a word, now and again? I think, said Miss Marple, that some threats are so old and so thoroughly understood between two people that they scarcely need to be spoken at all. I think we ought to find out a good deal more about Agnes Marsh before she came to Detheridge Parva 11 years ago, where she came from, and why, and whether she left anything, or anyone, behind her. Chapter 7. A Second Fright. The second incident, Whitcomb would not, at the inquest, allow it to be called an attack, though privately he thought of it as exactly that, came on the 5th day, and it recast, in one uneasy evening, everything the village had comfortably assumed about the case. Colonel Pike was found by his housekeeper at 9 o'clock, slumped in his study chair, breathing but unable to be roused, an empty glass of his usual nightly whisky and water on the desk beside him. Dr. Combe, summoned at a run, worked over him for the better part of an hour and pronounced him, at last, out of immediate danger, though gravely unwell. Chloral, Combe told Whitcomb afterward, grey-faced with the strain of it. A very heavy dose, in the whisky decanter itself, not just his glass, which means whoever did it couldn't have known exactly when, or how much, he'd drink, or whether anyone else in the house might have shared it. Reckless, or desperate, or both. Or, said Miss Marple, who had been permitted, by now, a certain quiet presence at these conferences that nobody quite remembered inviting, meant to look reckless, Doctor, so that we should all conclude the poisoner is panicking and striking wildly, when in fact the person who did this knew perfectly well that the Colonel drinks alone, at exactly 9, from that decanter, every single night of his life, and has done for years. It is not desperation, I think. It is simply someone who understands other people's habits very thoroughly indeed, and uses that understanding rather than any great cleverness with chemistry. But why the Colonel? Whitcomb said. If our murderer already got away with Mrs. Alderton clean as a whistle, heart failure, everyone satisfied, no questions, why risk a second attempt at all, and one so much more likely to be discovered? It was Millicent, oddly enough, over supper that same evening, who supplied the answer Miss Marple had already half-formed for herself. "The Colonel's been talking," Millicent said, buttering bread with more energy than the task required, "all over the village, since yesterday, saying he remembered something about that night, something he meant to tell the inspector properly, and dropping hints at the wheatsheaf like a man who fancies himself terribly important all of a sudden. I heard it from 3 separate people today." "Ah," said Miss Marple, very softly, setting down her fork. "Then he very nearly paid for his vanity with his life, poor foolish man. And I think, Millicent, we had better find out this instant exactly what it was he claimed to remember, before somebody makes quite certain he never gets the chance to say it at all." The Colonel, when Whitcomb reached his bedside the following morning, weak but lucid, was rather less forthcoming than his tavern boasting had suggested, which was, Miss Marple thought when she heard the account, entirely typical of vain men everywhere. "It wasn't much," he admitted, shamefaced. "Only," I remembered, thinking it over, that I'd gone round the back of the marquee that evening for a smoke where the vicar's wife wouldn't see me and lecture me about my chest, and I saw someone, just a shape really, in the dark, by the standpipe where they fill the urns, bent over something, quick, furtive-like, and gone again, before I'd properly registered it. I thought at the time it was one of the kitchen girls being sick from too much cider, if you'll forgive me, and thought no more of it. It was only after, turning it over, that it struck me that the shape was smaller than any of the kitchen girls, and moved, I don't know how to put it, carefully, like someone who didn't want to be seen, rather than someone who was merely unwell. Man or woman, Whitcomb pressed. I couldn't swear to it, the Colonel said, and looked, for the first time since Whitcomb had known him, genuinely frightened. "That's God's truth, Inspector. I couldn't swear to it at all, and I'll thank you to make that plain to whoever tried to put me to sleep permanently last night, because I've nothing more to tell them, and no wish whatsoever to have another go at finding out." Chapter 8. The Standpipe. The standpipe behind the marquee, a plain iron tap set into the churchyard wall, used all summer for filling the urns and watering the society's show blooms, yielded, on close inspection by Whitcomb's sergeant, nothing more dramatic than a rain barrel standing beside it, half full of stagnant water and fallen leaves. It was Miss Marple, walking that way the next afternoon, on the pretext of admiring the last of the Michaelmas daisies along the churchyard border, who asked the sexton, quite idly, whether the barrel was ever emptied. "Not till the frosts, ma'am, generally," he said. "No call to, in September. Why do you ask?" "No particular reason," said Miss Marple, which was not strictly true, and asked him, with the same idle mildness, whether he would be so very kind as to tip it out for her, since she had, she said, dropped a small brooch of sentimental value somewhere along that stretch of wall the previous week, and could not think where else it might have gone. The sexton, who was fond of Millicent's cousin, and had, besides, nothing more pressing to do that afternoon, obliged with good grace, and among the sodden leaves and drowned beetles that spilled across the churchyard grass, Miss Marple's sharp eyes found, within a very few minutes, a small object that was certainly not a brooch, a slim glass dropper of the kind sold by any chemist for measuring medicine, snapped clean in two at the bulb, its rubber teat perished with weeks, or, more likely, only days, of immersion. She did not touch it. She sent the sexton at once, with a message written in her own small firm hand, to fetch Inspector Whitcomb, and stood guard over the spot herself, quite composedly, until he arrived. "It's not Mrs. Alderton's own dropper," Whitcomb said, turning the pieces carefully in a handkerchief, once his sergeant had photographed them where they lay. "Dr. Combs already confirmed hers is silver, kept with the bottle, found safe in her dressing-table drawer. This is plain glass, ordinary, cheap, the sort of thing you'd find in any medicine chest in the village." "Which means," said Miss Marple, "that our poisoner did not use Mrs. Alderton's own case at all, could not have used it, in fact, without being seen to fumble with an unfamiliar clasp in front of witnesses, or without Mrs. Alderton herself objecting to a stranger's hand at her chatelaine, since by every account she was fiercely particular about measuring her own dose, and would have made a scene about anyone attempting to do it for her. No, I think our poisoner brought their own dropper, already filled with a fatal quantity of the tincture, and simply added its contents to the barley water glass when it was left unattended for a moment, which happens easily enough at a crowded supper, when the chairwoman is busy being chairwoman and her glass sits waiting on the little side table. Afterward, the dropper, evidence, and dangerous to be found on one's person, was thrown into the nearest deep water to hand, which happened to be this barrel, in the dark, in a moment's panic that was, I think, the only genuinely unplanned part of the whole business. And the silver case, found safe at home, that, I believe, was taken separately, perhaps earlier that same day, perhaps even the day before, and returned quietly to its drawer once the poisoner judged it safe to do so, precisely so that its absence should not, on the night itself, draw any particular attention. It argues, Inspector, a person who moves through that house as freely and unremarkably as furniture, a person nobody thinks to watch. Whitcomb looked at her for a long moment, the broken glass glinting faintly in his palm. "You mean the companion?" "I mean," said Miss Marple, "that it is time, I think, for somebody to have a proper conversation with Agnes Marsh. Not about heart drops, Inspector, but about wherever it was she lived before she came to Detheridge Parva 11 years ago, and what, exactly, she left there." Chapter 9. Before Detheridge Parva. It took Whitcomb 2 telephone calls and the better part of a day to establish what Miss Marple had already, in her own quiet fashion, begun to suspect, that Agnes Marsh had not always been Agnes Marsh at all. She had come to Mrs. Alderton's service in the spring of 1943, engaged through an agency in Bristol, with references that were perfectly satisfactory and entirely, as it turned out, unverifiable, since the lady who had supplied them had since died, and the household she had supposedly run had been requisitioned and scattered by the war. Before Bristol, the trail grew thinner still, until a patient clerk at Somerset House, telephoned by Whitcomb's sergeant with more persistence than hope, turned up a birth registration in Plymouth, 1929, for a girl named Doris Agnes Fenwick, mother's name given as Agnes Marsh, spinster, father's name left conspicuously, officially blank. Whitcomb sat with this piece of paper for a long while before he took it, rather grimly, to Miss Marple. "Doris," he said, "Doris Fenwick, from the tea shop. She's Agnes Marsh's daughter, given away, or fostered out, or something like it, as a baby, under whatever name the Fenwicks who raised her chose to give her, and Agnes herself came here to Detheridge Parva 11 years ago, apparently by pure chance of the agency's placing, and found her own child, grown into a young woman, not 400 yards from Mrs. Alderton's front door. Not, I think, entirely by chance," said Miss Marple gently. "I should be very surprised, Inspector, if a mother separated from her child in such sad and shameful circumstances, for it was shameful, in 1929, and would have cost her every prospect of respectable employment had it been generally known, did not spend a good many years finding out, quietly, wherever that child had been sent, and did not then arrange, as best she was able within her limited means, to be near her, even if never permitted to claim her. It is one of the saddest and most human things I have come across in all my years of noticing such matters, and I confess it does not surprise me in the least that Doris protected her at every turn, without either of them, perhaps, ever speaking the word mother aloud between them in 11 whole years. And Mrs. Alderton knew. Mrs. Alderton, said Miss Marple, kept a green notebook of other people's shames, Inspector, and recorded nothing at all about the one woman under her own roof who had the very deepest shame of the lot, by the standards of that unforgiving world. I think we may take it that she did not need to write it down, because she never for one single day allowed Agnes Marsh to forget that she knew it, and could, at any hour she chose, destroy in one sentence the only fragile, silent happiness that poor woman had left to her, the happiness of watching her own daughter grow up safe and respectable and utterly unaware, close enough to see, never close enough to hold. Whitcomb turned his hat slowly in his hands. That's enough motivation for murder, if ever I heard one. But it's 11 years of it, Miss Marple. Why now? Why last week, and not 5 years ago, or 8? That, said Miss Marple, folding her hands in her lap with the particular composure of a woman who believes she already knows the answer and is only waiting, out of good manners, to have it confirmed, is exactly the question I mean to put to Doris Fenwick myself this very afternoon, over a pot of lapsang tea, because I do not think, Inspector, that this was ever only about Agnes Marsh's old shame. I think something changed, very recently, that made an old and bearable threat suddenly unbearable, and I think Doris knows precisely what it was, whether or not she has yet understood its full and terrible significance. Chapter 10. What was in the notebook? Doris Fenwick, faced at last with a direct question asked kindly but without any pretense of not knowing what lay behind it, did what frightened people so often do when the pretending finally becomes too heavy to hold up. She put down the teapot she was carrying, sat, unbidden, at Miss Marple's table, and told the truth. "Osborne asked me to marry him in July," she said, twisting her apron in both hands. "We'd been careful, you understand, not saying anything, because his people wouldn't think me good enough, running a tea shop, and not knowing who my own father was even, let alone anything grander. But he asked me properly, in July, and I said yes, and we were going to tell everyone at Michaelmas, once he'd found the courage to face his mother about it. And Mrs. Alderton found out. She found out everything," Doris said, with sudden bitterness. "She came in for her tea the Tuesday before the harvest supper, and she said, very pleasant, very quiet, the way she always was when she meant to be cruelest. She said, what a pity it would be if certain facts about my birth came out just as the Trent family were getting used to the idea of me. She said Osborne's mother was a proud woman who'd sooner see her son unmarried forever than connected to a bastard, she said, plain as that, smiling the whole time over her lapsang, and connected, worse, to a mother who'd have to be produced or accounted for somehow once the questions started, because these things always come out eventually, don't they, in a village. She threatened to expose your parentage, and Agnes's. Doris's eyes filled, quick and sudden. I didn't even know then that she was my mother, not for certain, not until after. I'd wondered, sometimes, the way she was always so kind to me, always finding some excuse to stop and talk, always remembering my birthday with some little thing left anonymous at the shop door. But I never let myself believe it, because what good would it have done either of us? But Mrs. Alderton knew. She'd always known, I think, from the very day Agnes came to the village, and Mrs. Alderton, being who she was, made it her business to find out everything about everyone in her employ, and she used it, not against me, not directly, but against Agnes, all those years, to keep her exactly where she wanted her, cheap labour, and grateful for it, and never able to leave, because leaving would have meant losing the only chance she had of watching me from a distance. And when Mrs. Alderton threatened to tell the Trents, and ruin your engagement along with it, I went to Agnes, Doris said, very low, the night before the supper. I didn't know then what I was asking of her, or even that I was asking anything at all. I only wanted advice, from a kind woman who'd always been good to me, about what on earth I ought to do. And she looked at me for the longest time, and then she said not to worry, that she'd see to it Mrs. Alderton troubled nobody's happiness ever again. I thought she meant she'd talk to her, reason with her. I never for one moment thought she could not finish. Miss Marple reached across the small table, and with a gentleness that surprised even herself a little, covered the girl's clenched hands with her own. No, she said, I don't suppose you did, my dear. Mothers, even mothers who have never been permitted to say the word aloud, will very often go to lengths for a child that the child herself could scarcely imagine, still less ask for. You are not responsible for what Agnes chose to do with a burden she had carried, quite alone, for 11 long years. But I think now we had better go and see her together before this goes any further and someone else pays the price of her silence. Chapter 11. Small kindnesses remembered. It was Millicent, of all people, who supplied the detail that turned Miss Marple's careful suspicion into something very near certainty, and she supplied it, characteristically, without the faintest idea of its significance. Agnes Marsh is a good soul, whatever else comes of all this, she said, over their sherry that evening, having spent the afternoon, as she frequently did, exchanging news at the vicarage. Mrs. Constantine was only saying today, she quite broke down over it actually, poor thing, what with everything else weighing on her mind, that when her little boy had the scarlet fever 3 winters back, and the whole village was too frightened to come near the house, it was Agnes who sat up 2 whole nights running with him, cooling his fever, and never breathed a word of it to a soul afterward, not even to claim the credit. And when old Mrs. Fenwick, Doris's aunt, that raised her, kind woman but not well off, when she was dying 2 years since, it was Agnes who paid, anonymously, mind, for the proper nursing at the end, though heaven knows on what she could have saved it from that miserly wage Prudence Alderton paid her. She has spent 11 years, Miss Marple said quietly, doing small, unclaimed kindnesses for the people around her daughter, without ever once being able to claim the one kindness that mattered most, the right to say who she was. That is a very particular kind of loneliness, Millicent, and a very particular kind of love, and I think it explains a great deal about what has happened this week, that no amount of motive or opportunity, set down coldly in an inspector's notebook, could ever quite capture. You sound as though you feel sorry for her. I feel, said Miss Marple, with the careful precision she always used when the truth was uncomfortable, a very great deal of sorrow for her, and not one particle less certainty that she must answer for what she did. Both things can be true at once, my dear, however much the world likes to pretend otherwise. A person may be driven to a terrible act by years of a cruelty that nobody else troubled to notice, and may even in some private accounting of the heart deserve our pity for it, and may, at the very same time, have placed an innocent man's life at hazard with that dreadful business of the Colonel's whisky, purely to silence a witness who had, in fact, seen almost nothing at all. That second act, Millicent, is very much harder to forgive than the first, because it was not born of 11 years' unbearable provocation. It was born of simple, calculating self-preservation, and it very nearly cost a foolish, harmless old man his life for the sake of a boast he made at the wheat sheaf. She set down her sherry glass, and there was, for the first time in the whole business, a certain steel beneath her customary mildness. I think, Millicent, that the time has come to speak to Inspector Whitcomb about how we might best bring this to a close, not in some private room, with only the guilty and the grieving present, but somewhere the whole village can see it done properly, so that Agnes Marsh may finally, whatever else happens to her now, stop having to hide. Chapter 12. The Plan. Inspector Whitcomb did not, at first, care for Miss Marple's suggestion. A public confrontation at the Church Fete Committee's own tea, with half the village looking on. It's not how these things are generally done, Miss Marple, and I can't say I relish the notion of a scene. I don't relish it either, Inspector, and I promise you there need be no scene at all if it is managed with a little care. But I have found, in a long life of watching human nature under pressure, that a guilty conscience carried quietly and alone for many days will very often crack of its own accord under the simple weight of ordinary conversation continuing around it as though nothing at all were wrong, provided only that the conversation is steered very gently toward the one subject that conscience cannot bear to hear discussed lightly. Agnes Marsh has held herself together for a week now by believing, I think, that no one suspects her, and that Doris is safe, and that the worst is behind her. If she is allowed to go on believing that a little longer, in a room full of familiar, ordinary faces, and then finds the ground quietly, carefully removed from beneath that belief, I think, Inspector, she will tell us herself, more completely and more usefully than any amount of questioning in a cold interview room could ever achieve. And it will spare Doris, I think, the much crueler ordeal of watching her mother taken away in handcuffs from her own kitchen, with no warning at all. Whitcomb considered this for a long moment, turning his hat, as he so often did, slowly in his hands. And if you're wrong, if she simply denies it and walks away, and we've tipped our hand for nothing, then, Inspector, you will have lost very little beyond an afternoon's tea, and you may proceed with whatever more conventional methods you think best. But I do not believe I am wrong. I have been wrong before, as I have told you, but not, I think, about this. The occasion chosen was the vicarage's regular Thursday committee tea, the same small, unremarkable gathering, Miss Marple noted with a certain deliberate irony, at which the Garden Society's business had so often, in happier days, been conducted, and to which Agnes Marsh, as a long-time and blameless member of the parish, would naturally be expected, along with Colonel Pike, now sufficiently recovered to attend, propped in an armchair with a rug over his knees, and Mrs. Constantine and Doris, invited specially by Miss Marple on the pretext of helping with the sandwiches, and Osborne Trent, invited on no pretext at all beyond Miss Marple's quiet conviction that he, too, had a part yet to play. Whitcomb himself would be present, ostensibly to give the village a reassuring update on the progress of his inquiries, an update he had agreed, with visible reluctance, to phrase exactly as Miss Marple suggested. "It goes against every instinct I have," he told her, on the vicarage doorstep, letting a case turn on tea and sandwiches instead of proper evidence. "You have your proper evidence, Inspector," said Miss Marple placidly. "The broken dropper, the digitalis, the birth registration, the chloral in the Colonel's decanter. What you are lacking is a confession that spares an innocent girl the sight of her mother dragged away in disgrace before the whole village has even properly understood why. I am simply proposing to supply that confession in the gentlest manner available to us. Shall we go in? I believe the kettle is nearly on." Chapter 13. Tea at the vicarage. The vicarage drawing-room, on a mild Thursday afternoon with the last of the dahlias nodding in the window box, seemed a very unlikely stage for the unmasking of a murderer, and that, Miss Marple reflected, taking her seat by the window with a full view of the room, was precisely its usefulness. Agnes Marsh arrived last, as she generally did, having stayed behind at Elm Walk. The Alderton house now half-shuttered, its future undecided, to see to some final matter of the estate's untidy paperwork. She took the chair nearest the door, as she always did, with the particular unassuming stillness of a woman who has spent a lifetime making herself as small and as little trouble as possible, and accepted a cup of tea with a murmur of thanks that drew no one's eye at all. Inspector Whitcomb, sitting rather stiffly with a plate of seed cake he did not touch, delivered his promised update with the wooden discomfort of a man reading a part he had not fully learned. "We've made a good deal of progress," he said. "The digitalis has been traced conclusively to a common household preparation, easily obtained by anyone with a little knowledge of herbs. Foxglove grows wild enough along the churchyard wall, as several of you will know. We're satisfied that the same person responsible for Mrs. Alderton's death also attempted to silence Colonel Pike, on account of something he believed he'd witnessed that night near the standpipe." "Believed?" said the Colonel, with feeling, from his armchair. "I've told you a dozen times, Inspector, I saw next to nothing worth silencing a man over." "Which is, in its own way, the saddest part of the whole business," said Miss Marple, in the mild conversational tone she might have used to remark upon the weather, and the room turned to her, as it always, eventually, did. "That someone should have taken so very great a risk, and caused so very great a fright, over so very little real danger. It suggests, I think, a person acting not from cold calculation at all, but from simple, exhausted terror, the terror of someone who has already done one dreadful thing to protect a person she loves beyond all reason, and cannot now bear the thought of that sacrifice being wasted through some small, unlucky slip of the Colonel's tongue at the wheat sheaf." "You make it sound almost sympathetic," said Mrs. Constantine, a little unsteadily, glancing, Miss Marple noted, not at Whitcomb, but for one unguarded instant at Agnes Marsh, who had not moved, and whose teacup had not, Miss Marple observed, come any nearer her lips since the inspector began to speak. "It is sympathetic, Mrs. Constantine, and that is exactly what makes it so very hard, and so very necessary, to say plainly. I do not think any of us, hearing the whole of it, will find it easy to condemn without a very great deal of pity mixed in. But pity, however genuine, cannot undo a poisoning, nor excuse the danger to an innocent man's life, and I am quite sure, in fact, that the person who did these things knows that as well as anyone in this room, and has known it, with growing weight, every single hour since the night of the supper." The room had gone very quiet. Osborne Trent, by the window, had turned rather white. Doris, seated with the sandwich plate still balanced on her knees, was staring fixedly at the carpet, her knuckles pale where she gripped it. "For 11 years, Miss Marple went on gently, and did not look at Agnes Marsh at all, which was, in its own way, more terrible than looking. A certain person in this village carried a secret so heavy that it shaped every single choice she made, where she worked, how she lived, what small unclaimed kindnesses she was permitted to offer, and what larger ones she was forever forbidden even to name. She bore it, I think, with extraordinary patience, because the alternative, losing even the small, distant comfort of watching a beloved face grow up safe, was unbearable to her. And then, quite suddenly, that patience was no longer enough, because the person she loved most in the world stood at last on the very edge of happiness, and a cruel woman threatened, quite deliberately, and for no better reason than her own love of power, to snatch that happiness away in the same casual breath she used to order her evening tonic. Chapter 14. The Silence Breaks. It was Agnes Marsh's teacup that broke the stillness. Not thrown, not dropped in any dramatic fashion, but set down, very carefully, in its saucer, with the small, precise click of a woman who has finally set down a much heavier burden than china. "I didn't plan it," she said. Her voice, when it came, was steady, and that steadiness, Miss Marple thought, was somehow more affecting than any weeping could have been. "I want that understood. Whatever else you think of me, I didn't plan it for 11 years, or even for 11 days. I went to bed the night Doris came to me, meaning only to think of some way to reason with Prudence, or to leave the district altogether and take Doris, take my daughter, with me, whatever the scandal, and start again somewhere she wouldn't be shamed by my past. But in the morning, getting Prudence's tray ready as I had every morning for 11 years, I found myself simply measuring, adding a little extra to the dropper I always used to test the tincture's strength before giving it to her, the way she'd trained me to, because she trusted no hand but her own with the dose except in that one small preparatory step. And once it was measured, it seemed almost as though the decision had already been made somewhere else, and all that remained was to carry it out. "You brought your own dropper to the supper," Miss Marple said quietly, rather than use hers. I couldn't touch her chatelaine without her noticing. She'd have made a fuss, in front of everyone, if anyone but herself went near it. But her glass sat unwatched on that little table for the better part of 10 minutes, while she held court by the marquee entrance, boasting to the vicar about the marrows. It took a moment. It took less than a moment, and then it was done, and I couldn't undo it, even standing there watching her drink it. I told myself it was mercy, a weak heart, everyone would say, a merciful, quick end to a woman who was going to spend the next 30 years making Doris's life a misery and mine a prison. I told myself a great many things that night, Mrs. Marple, and I have told myself a great many more since, and none of them, in the end, have made it easier to sleep. And the case, Mrs. Alderton's own case, found so properly in its drawer, I took it 2 days before, on some pretext of cleaning it, meaning only to be sure of the strength of what remained in the bottle, so I'd know how much of my own preparation to use for the same effect. I put it back that same evening, before anyone could think it was strange it was missing even for an hour. I never meant anyone to look twice at that little case at all. And the Colonel's whiskey? For the first time, Agnes's steadiness faltered, and something like genuine shame, the first shame she had shown for anything that night, more than for the murder itself, crossed her worn, careful face. That was cowardice, pure and simple, and I've been ashamed of it every hour since. He was talking at the wheat sheaf, saying he'd remembered something, showing off about it to anyone who'd listen, and I was so frightened. Not for myself, Inspector. I want that understood too. I'd have confessed the whole of it gladly if it were only my own neck at stake, but frightened that if he was questioned properly and the whole business came out, it would all fall on Doris in the end anyway. The shame of it, her mother a murderess, her engagement finished a second time over, and worse than before. I only meant to make him sleep soundly, and unable to remember clearly what little he'd seen. I never weighed his dose properly. I don't know chloral the way I know digitalis, and it was only afterward, hearing how ill he'd been, that I understood how close I'd come to killing a second, wholly innocent man, for no better reason than my own fear. That is the part I cannot forgive in myself, whatever anyone else chooses to think of the rest of it. Doris had crossed the room, without anyone quite seeing her move, and knelt now beside Agnes's chair, one hand over the older woman's clenched fingers, weeping without any attempt to hide it. Agnes did not look at her. It was, Miss Marple thought, watching them both with an ache she made no effort to conceal, the single most heartbreaking detail of the entire dreadful afternoon, that even now, with everything else laid bare, Agnes Marsh could not quite bring herself to claim, aloud, in front of the whole room, the one word she had waited 11 years to say. "You may say it, my dear," Miss Marple said gently, "to no one in particular, and to everyone. Whatever else must follow now, I think you have more than earned the right to say it, at least once, in front of people who will understand exactly what it costs you." Agnes Marsh looked, at last, at her daughter's bent head, and her hand turned, slowly, to hold the hand covering it. "My girl," she said, very quietly, and it was enough. Chapter 15. What the law allowed Inspector Whitcomb, to his considerable credit, allowed the moment its full weight before he rose, with evident reluctance, and did what duty required of him. "Agnes Marsh," he said, "I must ask you to come with me now to Market Sedding, and I have to tell you that anything you say may be used as evidence." "I understand, Inspector," Agnes said, rising with a composure that seemed, now that the confession was out, almost restful by comparison with the strain of the preceding days. I have said the whole of it already, and I don't intend to say a word, only, and here, for the first time, her voice caught properly, only let me say goodbye to her properly, if that's allowed. I've never once, in 11 years, been allowed to say goodbye to her as her mother. I would like, at the very least, to do that. Whitcomb, glancing once at Miss Marple, who inclined her head very slightly, allowed it, and stood himself a discreet distance off by the window, while mother and daughter spoke together, low and urgent, for the several minutes that decency and the law between them would permit. It was Colonel Pike, in the awkward silence that followed the front door's closing, who spoke first, gruffly, into his teacup. "I don't mind admitting, Mrs. Marple, that I'd sooner she'd get clean away with it. Prudence Alderton made that poor woman's life a misery for 11 years, by every account, and threatened a young girl's whole happiness into the bargain, purely for the pleasure of exercising a little power over people who couldn't fight back. I find it very hard to be sorry a woman like that is gone, whatever the law says about the manner of her going. I understand the sentiment, Colonel, and I will confess I share a good deal of it myself," said Miss Marple, folding her hands in her lap with her customary composure, though there was, Millicent noted, a certain tiredness about her this evening that had not been there before. "But I have found, over a long life of observing these matters, that once we permit ourselves to excuse a killing on the grounds that the victim thoroughly deserved it, we have taken a step onto very treacherous ground indeed. For who, then, is to judge what constitutes sufficient deserving, and where the line is to be drawn, and what becomes of the next innocent bystander who happens to be caught, quite by accident, in the path of someone else's righteous fury? Agnes Marsh, whatever her provocation, poisoned one woman and very nearly poisoned a second who had done her no wrong at all beyond an old man's foolish vanity. I can pity her with my whole heart, Colonel, and still believe, quite firmly, that she must answer for it. Both are true. I have said as much before, and I find, tonight, that I believe it more firmly than ever. And the girl, Doris? Doris, said Miss Marple, has done nothing whatever wrong, beyond loving a mother she was never permitted to properly know. And I hope, I very much hope, Colonel, that this village has the decency, now the whole sad truth is out, to let her keep her young man and her tea-shop, and whatever fragile happiness she can build from the wreckage of it, without visiting her mother's crime upon her own innocent head. If Dethridge Parver cannot manage that much kindness, after everything Prudence Alderton's cruelty has already cost this place, then I confess I shall think a good deal less of it than I presently do. Chapter 16. The Last of the Harvest. The assizes, when they came, some months later, dealt with Agnes Marsh more gently than the plain facts of poisoning might have led anyone to expect. The jury moved, it was generally said afterward, by the quiet, unadorned dignity with which she gave her evidence, and by the testimony, offered, at Doris's own insistence, over Mrs. Constantine's gentle objection, of 11 years' unclaimed kindnesses, remembered now by half the village, once they had troubled to look back and add them up properly. She was not hanged. The verdict came down, in the end, to manslaughter, on grounds the newspapers termed diminished responsibility, brought on by prolonged and deliberate persecution, a form of words that satisfied no one entirely, and yet seemed, on the whole, very nearly just. Doris married Osborne Trent the following spring, in a small ceremony at the very church where the harvest supper's ill-fated tent had once stood in the meadow behind, and if his mother attended with something less than perfect warmth, she attended none the less, which Miss Marple, hearing of it from Millicent's faithful correspondence some weeks later, judged progress enough for one small village to manage in so short a time. "You were quite right about all of it, in the end," Millicent wrote in the same letter, "though I still cannot think how you knew to look in that dreadful rain barrel of all places. I should never have thought of it in 100 years. Miss Marple, reading this by her own fireside in St. Mary Mead, where the last of her own modest dahlias were fading gracefully in the October cold, smiled a small private smile, and set the letter aside without immediately answering it, though she meant to, in a day or two, once she had properly considered what to say. It was not, in truth, so very mysterious a piece of deduction as Millicent seemed to imagine. It was only, she reflected, picking up her knitting again with the calm satisfaction of a woman for whom human nature held very few remaining surprises, that people so often looked for wickedness in loud voices and violent tempers, in the colonels who quarrelled openly and the young men who looked pale and guilty, and overlooked, again and again, the small, quiet, unregarded women who moved through every household like furniture, seeing everything, forgiven nothing, and carrying, very often, the oldest and heaviest griefs of all beneath the most unremarkable exteriors imaginable. Prudence Alderton had spent a lifetime believing that power lay in knowing other people's secrets and holding them, always, just close enough to threaten. She had never once considered, in all her careful cataloguing of colonels and vicars' wives, that the deepest secret in her own household was not one she had discovered at all, but one she had helped, quite deliberately and for 11 cruel years, to keep buried, and that a heart pressed long enough and hard enough into silence will, sooner or later, in one way or another, find some terrible means of speaking at last. Miss Marple set another stitch, and thought, not for the first time in her long life, that the human heart was a very much stranger garden than any the Detheridge Parva Horticultural Society had ever judged at its yearly show, full of growths nobody had planted on purpose, flowering, when they flowered at all, in the dark, unwatched corners, where nobody had ever thought to look. Outside, the first frost of the year was settling quietly over the village, and somewhere down the lane a dog barked twice and then, as dogs do, thought better of it, and the whole of St. Mary Mead subsided, once again, into its ordinary, watchful, deceptively peaceful evening quiet.